Hello, seniors. I am down the hall facilitating the ACT, so I figured this was the easiest way to get the notes to you. Also, hopefully, juniors, after you're done completing your ACT, you can go through these notes just for a couple of minutes when you're back at home relaxing. Our plan is still to get to that lab quiz on Friday, and we have just a couple of organs left to discuss, so I wanted to get through a couple of them today. So, just to review what you guys hopefully learned yesterday in the digestion lab, is that there are a lot of processes that help to mechanically break down food as it goes through the digestive system. It starts in the mouth and goes all the way through the esophagus, small intestine, large intestine, and then finally until excretion occurs at the very end of the process. So the muscles of the gastrointestinal tract are going to facilitate all of these processes, and they can either be skeletal muscles, which are voluntary, or they can be smooth muscles, which are involuntary and operate because of reflexes. Those reflexes can respond to things like the chemical nature of the food, whether or not it's digested enough, or whether it contains certain types of chemicals. But most often, that smooth muscle is responding to a stretch reflex or amount of pressure building up behind that sphincter muscle. So, skeletal muscle, since it is voluntary, is going to primarily facilitate processes that are happening at the beginning, so in the mouth, things like mastication or chewing, and deglutition, which is swallowing. And then, of course, at the very end of the process, which would be defecation. Luckily, the skeletal muscles at the very beginning and at the very end of the GI tract allow us to have voluntary control over those processes. We talked on Monday also about how sometimes if you have a brainstem injury or some other type of traumatic brain injury, people might actually forget or need to relearn how to chew and swallow so that they can safely ingest food by mouth. Also, we know that little babies don't have control over their external anal sphincters quite yet, so they, of course, do not have control over defecation. Everything else is facilitated by smooth muscle, so that could be the peristalsis and propulsion through the esophagus, the mashing together and mixing that happens in the stomach, and then, of course, all of the processes we're going to talk about today with the small and large intestine that allows for absorption and the movement of materials until we finally get to the defecation process. So yesterday we left off talking about the liver. The liver is the largest digestive organ, or the largest gland in the body, and of course it's the largest in the digestive system as well. And attached to the bottom of this largest gland in the body is the gallbladder. So the gallbladder is green in real life. It is not artificially colored like most of the organs or body systems that we look at this year, because its main job is to actually concentrate the bile that is produced by the liver. So remember, the liver has two main jobs for our bodies, and number one is to activate nutrients and detoxify medicines, alcohol, any toxins that you may have ingested. But also, it has a secretion called bile, and this bile will help to help emulsify or make lipids a little bit friendlier with water. So occasionally, this gallbladder will actually build up with these little pebbles that we call gallstones, because the bile itself can actually crystallize if you have certain genetic predispositions, or your diet isn't quite right, or just kind of is bad luck sometimes. And these gallstones can get lodged in these ducts. That can be very painful, obviously, and so oftentimes if the gallbladder is full of these gallstones, or a gallstone has been stuck in that duct, they can either zap it with a laser, and usually the first symptom is cholecystitis, which is inflammation of the gallbladder, and that can be seen through ultrasound or a CT scan. But most often, if you have recurrent gallstones, they will just take the gallbladder out. They call this a cholecystectomy. And people that have had their gallbladder removed generally don't see major changes to their lives, other than they have a little bit tougher time digesting lipids. So both my my father and sister-in-law have had their gallbladders removed, and as long as they don't eat like a whole bunch of cheese or like cheese curds, things that have been deep fried, they don't even really notice that they don't have a gallbladder anymore. So that bile will then enter the small intestine more diluted, because the gallbladder's job is to concentrate it. So all of the secretions from the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder will all spill into the first segment of the small intestine. So the small intestine is named not because of its length, because it's actually very, very long, but because of its diameter. So all of the features of our digestive system have been adapted over time. And so having a very, very long small intestine helps to increase the surface area for absorption. You guys calculated some of those surface areas yesterday, or if you haven't gotten to that part of the questions yet, you will at the end of your digestion lab. And the surface area of the small intestine is enormous. It's very, very large because its main job is to finish chemical digestion and then to actually absorb the simple sugars, the amino acids, the nucleic acids, and of course the lipids into the bloodstream so that you can build what your body needs to maintain homeostasis and stay alive. So that first region where all those secretions are kind of dumped into is called the duodenum. After that, we have the main and the longest portion of the small intestine called the jejunum. And then the ileum is the longest portion. And make sure you practice saying these words because they're kind of weird. So duodenum, jejunum, ileum. And the ileum has the same name as the part of the hip bone where it is located more or less. Also remember that the pyloric sphincter is the distal sphincter of the stomach, and the distal sphincter of the small intestine is called the ileocecal sphincter, and we'll see in a minute how the ileum is the terminal portion of the small intestine, and the cecum is the proximal portion of the large intestine. So if you remember back to all of those anatomical terms from Unit 1, we can use the terms proximal and distal, not just for appendages, but we can use it with these tubular structures as well, with proximal being closest to where it begins. So the duodenum is the proximal portion of the small intestine, and then distal would be the far end or farthest from where it begins. Then the ileum is going to be the distal part. So you can see subtle differences in color here. The small intestine basically zigzags back and forth all the way through the abdomen. And again, its length is enormous and it has a very high surface area. Our last organ is going to be the large intestine, and we can see here that it is split into a little bit more logical names: ascending, transverse, and then descending. The sigmoid colon is named because it forms kind of an S shape before finally exiting the body through the pelvic girdle, and then we call that last portion the rectum. And we'll get to those in just a minute. I wanted to point them out while we have a nice diagram here. So the small intestine's main job is to finish chemical digestion and to absorb all of those nutrients. So a majority of the cells in the mucosa are absorptive cells. They have villi, which are little finger-like projections on the mucosal surface. So each cell, if my hand was a cell, each cell would have these villi, and then my villi are going to have villi. So that's almost like little hairs sticking out of the villi. So these microvilli not only absorb, but they also secrete enzymes to help finish that final chemical digestion. Sprinkled among the mucosa is also goblet cells that secrete mucus because we still want things to keep on moving through. We don't want it to get stuck. Paneth cells are the immune system cells, and then three types of hormonal or endocrine cells: S, CCK, and K cells, and we'll talk about their secretions later. And as we mentioned, the total length, the folds, the villi, and the microvilli all are going to contribute to the enormous surface area of the small intestine. So here's a cross-section of the villi in that mucosa. And if you look really carefully, you can see the little microvilli, the little hairs on the surface of each of those finger-like projections. You can take a closer look at these if you want to pause and read about all of their secretions, but just know that a majority of the small intestine is going to be those absorbed cells. So another secretion of the small intestine is what's called intestinal juice. Kind of like saliva, kind of like stomach secretions. It's going to be a unique cocktail for each meal or each chemical ingestion that you make. So it's going to neutralize the pH, and that's going to be, of course, because of some of the secretions of the pancreas, but also those liver enzymes and additionally the brush border enzyme. So these are the enzymes secreted by those absorptive cells that help to do that final digestion of food products. So here's a nice diagram showing the pH of the different portions of the digestive system. So we can see very acidic in the stomach, And as we go through, it gets almost completely neutral in the small intestine, and then just a little bit more acidic again in the first portion in that ascending colon. That's mostly because of the microbiome that lives in your gut, and we'll talk about that again in just a little bit. So when we're looking at the different segments of the small intestine, we can see there are some structural differences as well. So here we're looking at the duodenum kind of zoomed out and then zoomed in, and we can see almost 100%, especially on these the edges of these villi, are absorptive cells. The bright white ones are those goblet cells that secrete mucus. And keep an eye on those because they're the ones that can be pretty telling as to which part of the small intestine we are in. They're going to get more abundant as we get more distal in the small intestine. We can also see these intestinal glands, and these are only present in the duodenum. Sometimes we call them duodenal glands because they're the only place that they are found. So besides the chemical digestion that is facilitated by these enzymes, we also have mechanical digestion that continues. The main process that helps with absorption is called segmentation. And this is a really nice diagram that you can see that the material isn't actually propulsed forward. Instead, it's just getting mixed together. So you can see initially we have areas of blue and areas of yellow, and they get mixed together until it all is one continuous one continuous color. So this is going to mix all of those enzymes and juices together and also provide accessibility to all those villi and microvilli because they have a better chance of coming in contact with one of those absorptive cells. Once 3 to 5 hours have passed of segmentation in the small intestine, then the migrating motility complex will cause all of the small intestine to move forward at once, and this is peristalsis, just like we saw in the esophagus. So each kind of molecule, each time of macromolecule will have a different fate during this process of digestion. It's all just chemistry. Remember, things that are happening in your body rely on biochemistry. So carbohydrates are the simplest and easiest to digest because they're only carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So they're the first to begin digestion in the mouth and the first to be absorbed. Monosaccharides are generally how they're absorbed. Non-digestible carbohydrates are called starches or fiber, and they are a big proportion of fecal matter. Proteins are also going to be the next easiest to digest, but their digestion won't begin until we get the acidic environment of the stomach. They will get absorbed in the intestine as short chain amino acids or individual amino acids. Lipids are a lot more complicated because they require that bile in order to emulsify or make them a little bit more hydrophilic. And they're actually absorbed not into the bloodstream, but into the lymphatic system, which we talked about in our last unit. And finally, nucleic acids, they are digested a lot like proteins because they're just long chains as well. They're going to be absorbed by individual nitrogenous bases. After digestion and absorption, each component is then used to build whatever it is that your body needs. So when you need proteins, you're going to take those amino acids and build them into hair and skin and new nails and actin and myosin for your muscles. The same thing is going to happen for each of these groups in order to build, repair, and maintain the body. The other components of your food besides these macromolecules are also really important for maintenance of the body. First, we have electrolytes, which are salts, and those are really important for the absorption of water as well. Vitamins are also absorbed, very important part of your diet because they serve as sometimes they're parts of chemical reactions that we really need and we can't produce ourselves. So we have to ingest these in order to provide vitamins A, B, C, D, E, and K. They will be absorbed with their chemical cousins. So A, D, E, and K are lipid soluble, so they'll be absorbed with lipids. Vitamins B and C are water soluble. There's really good diagrams in your book about all this. If you want to take a closer look, feel free. The big take-home point here is that fats have to go through the lymphatic system. Okay, so I think we're going to stop there. We were trying to get through the large intestine, but I think I'm just about out of time here. So your assignment for today is to finish and turn in your digestion lab from yesterday. Finish and turn in exercise 34. You can just turn it in person tomorrow too. You don't need to scan all the pages. And then remember that lab quiz 8 is still scheduled for Friday. Feel free to email me or send me a reminder with questions. See you all tomorrow.